Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode on the channel. Today I'm building a gaming/editing machine. So today we're going to start this build with some Vengeance RAM. This RAM is from Corsair, it's DDR4 RAM. I bought two packages of the 2x8s, which is 16 in each package, so we're actually going to have 32 gigs of RAM. So the important part when installing RAM is you want to make sure that if you're putting the full maximum capacity of RAM in your system, and if it's dual channel, to use the opposing channels. So the first package I installed on the two gray slots, and the two other pieces of RAM I installed on the two black spots. So it doesn't matter if you mix up the packages, but it does matter if you're only installing one set of RAM. I would recommend installing it on the same slot series. So the next thing I noticed is that the fan on the CPU cooler couldn't fit. So I bought a Cool Master cooler, but I had to buy a smaller cooler, not their big size, because of the RAM. So since I was installing 4 sticks of RAM, the cooler actually had to be swapped to the other side. So to do this, I actually just had to remove these plastic tabs that are on this fan to reveal the screws, because I wanted to swap the direction of airflow so that the air was still flowing towards the back of the machine and out the back of the case. It's really important that your airflow is going continuously throughout your machine, because you want the air to come in the front and out the back or through the top of the case like this case is designed. I find that it works a little bit better, and with this ASUS Prime Z390A board that we're using, it's really important that we have a constant airflow, because the fans are actually regulated by the motherboard, which is very cool. We're also going to be installing a Core i7 8th generation processor, actually a 9th generation processor that has 3.6 gigahertz turbo to 4.9 gigahertz. So you can see on the fan, there's two different directions for the fan. On the side of the fan, it'll show you which way the air is blowing. It's pretty simple to install the two brackets. You bring it to the other side and then screw it down. So just get the first screw started, and then the second screw started a little bit more, so that way it's even on the bracket. And you don't want to do it too tight. I did it a little bit tight, and I actually broke a part of the fan, but it was still okay because I only cracked it. I didn't fully snap it. So this fan doesn't have to be too snug on the brackets, because once it's clipped into the Cool Master system, it'll be held in there pretty well. So looking at this board here, on top of the Prime logo, you can see that we have 6 SATA ports. So this machine is actually going to have a lot of storage installed on it, because it is an editing machine. It could be used for gaming, but it's primarily going to be used for editing. So we wanted to make sure that we had enough RAM, a very good CPU, and we're going to have a really nice graphics card installed in this system. So you can see here that I installed the fan on the opposite side that it was originally installed on. And where this fan is going to be blowing is it's going to be blowing towards the back of the case, towards where the Prime plastic cover is, and it's going to flow out the back of the case. So you just want to make sure that the wire isn't going to get hot. So I just tucked it away and made sure it was away from all the heat pipes. So the next piece of the system that I'm installing is the SSD. So to install an SSD, you have to remove the metal portion of the board, which is actually going to act as a cooler for this SSD. Here I have a 1 terabyte WD Blue SSD. So I went with a regular SATA SSD. It is NVMe, but it is a SATA connection. So if you do want the SSD to work properly, you are going to have to get a SATA connection for this SSD. As you can see, I did place the board on top of this table. I know that you shouldn't really do that because you don't want the electromagnetic currents to touch, but I was using the box for a majority of the video. So the SSD, you can see that I didn't actually place it on the table. It was on top of the plastic the entire time. To get the SSD installed, you actually have to install some screws to level out the SSD before you install it into the board. This SSD didn't come with any screws. You had to use the screws that come with the motherboard. The screws on this motherboard are very, very small, just like any other SSD you'd have to install. It's the same as the laptop ones. So this green stuff that you see that I took the plastic off of is actually a cooler to help conduct the heat from the metal from the SSD to the metal, so that the SSD can stay cool while you're doing editing or gaming. So here's an image of the case that we're using. So it does have 4 hard drive bays, 2 CD slots, and it has room for about 5 fans. Well, you could probably slip a 6th fan in there if you weren't using the CD drives. So you can see I went ahead and I installed the fans. I made sure that the direction was pointing out of the case and not into the case. So I actually removed the fan that was in there originally because I wanted to use all the fans that I purchased. I find that having one type of fan inside the system, even though they were both from one was from Fractal, one was from Coolmaster. This is a Coolmaster case. I find that the Fractal fans are slightly quieter and they do last longer in systems, even though with the Coolmaster you'd have similar results. What's interesting with this case is I found that it was on the smaller side. So it is a full ATX tower case. But since we were putting so much stuff inside of this case, I actually had a hard time fitting it. So the back plate that you saw me install there, where all the USBs plug into, just a nice fancy cover. I actually had to uninstall that because I couldn't get the motherboard in when I was trying to fit it after I installed everything. So when installing the fans, you want to make sure that you use the correct screws. I use the screws that came with the case. A majority of the times when you're buying expensive cases like this one, the screws will come included in the box, which is really nice. That way you don't have to worry about finding the screws elsewhere. The Fractal fans actually do come with their own screws, which is good too. I used the ones that I already had because I really like that design. The ones that come with the Fractal fans are just as good. You can see them off to the left hand side of the screen in the small little plastic baggie. I did end up using them towards the end of the video just because they were easier to use. So after I got that last fan installed, I went ahead and I started to install the power supply. So we have a Corsair RM850X power supply. So it's an 850 watt power supply. This is one of their fancier power supplies. It's actually modular, and all the cables came in a really nice Corsair package, which was really interesting to see. The highest wattage power supply I've ever purchased was a 750 watt power supply. But since we were putting a lot of stuff in this system, I just wanted to make sure that it could be expanded if needed in the future. We are going to be having over 32 terabytes of storage in this system, just to hold all the videos that we're going to be creating in 4K. So here's the power supply. It looks really nice. It's in that matte black finish. It was a decent weighted power supply. It's pretty heavy. And all the cables snapped in really nicely on the back of it. To secure it to the machine, I actually installed it first. Most of the time I'll install the power supply first just so I can run the cables before the motherboard's in. But for this one, if I was going to change my build, I would have actually installed the power supply after installing the motherboard because I had such a hard time installing the motherboard into the case. So you can see the power supply here. It's really cool. The fan is actually a different color than the outside of the power supply, but you won't see that once it's installed in the case because the fan is actually on the bottom side of the case. So you can see the spec sheet here if you need to of the Corsair fan. All I really needed was I needed a lot of SATA ports just in case we do expand our storage in this machine in the future, and if I wanted to add a second graphics card. So one of the most important parts of a system is cable management, and I'm going to skip through most of this part of the video. Just when you're doing cable management, you want to make sure that all your cables are very snug and neatly tied away in the back of the case. Most cases nowadays, you'll actually have 2 panels, one on the back and one on the front. And when I build a PC, I usually try to fit all of the cables in the back side of the case instead of having them shown through that glass portion of the case, or plastic in this case. So you can see here when I was trying to install the motherboard, I actually had to remove the prime cover, which was holding the motherboard out of place. I couldn't seem to get enough grip on the motherboard to get into the slots, and the fan was also getting in the way. So I did have to remove one of the fans to get this motherboard installed. It was a little bit tricky to do that. Before you install the motherboard, I do recommend looking for where the case will have its power on switch, its reset switch, and any other USBs, because it was really hard to see, especially in a kitchen where I was working, to try and figure out where all the parts would go. One thing that I really like to do is, you can see I tied up the fans where the cables were. I always try to make sure that the cables are not going to be touching any fans, because if they are, there's a chance that that cable will break over time, or you'll get a really bad noise coming from the machine because of how many times the cable will be hitting that fan. So you can see here I started to install some of the storage into this device. So we're going to have a couple of different storage options for this device. So our first drive that I'm installing is a WD Red 4 or 5 terabyte hard drive. So why I'm installing this is because this is going to be the drive that we're going to use to actually edit our footage off of. It's actually a NAS drive, so it's meant to be used and abused, and it's not like a typical hard drive. This hard drive can run constantly for long periods of time, which is really good when video editing. So that was actually a 4 terabyte WD Red drive. Our next drives are actually going to be WD's 14 terabyte helium drives. So originally I was going to go with Seagate's Iron Wolf drives, but I did get a deal on the WD 14 terabyte helium drives. These are really expensive, and the helium actually keeps the drives cooler while they're running. So the graphics card that we're going to be installing today is pretty fancy. It's a 2070, and it's from Gigabyte. And of course, it does have usually has RGB. This one didn't quite come with it because we did opt for the lower priced graphics card, but it does have RTX in it, which is really cool. I have a 1650, I believe, in my other machine, and it actually has RGB in the side of it. This one, I haven't seen any RGB from it, but that would be pretty cool to see. So we opted for the dual fan graphics card just because we're going to be using most of it. We probably won't use the full extent of the graphics card while video editing, but it's always good to have that extra little kick in there in case you need it. So you can see I'm installing the WD helium drives here in this portion of the video. I wanted to make sure that they were securely in the machine. Originally I was thinking of putting them both on the bottom, but I put them in the middle of the case just in case there was some vibration from that WD Red drive. It's at the bottom of the case, so it shouldn't affect them as much as it would if the WD Red drive was higher in the case, because the WD Red drive will be in use constantly, and the helium drives are just for storage of pictures and family videos. Also, a cool little trick that I use is this Seagate drive that you can see that I'm tearing apart. I'm actually going to be putting into this machine. So I just pry it apart with a screwdriver, because the Seagate drives are actually cheaper to buy as portable drives than they are to buy single-handedly. I'm not sure why this is, but this is a 5 terabyte drive that I'm currently tearing apart. This is just a regular archival storage drive. There's nothing fancy about this drive. It's just going to be used for a couple of programs that we're going to be having on this PC. You can see here the final touches I'm adding to this computer build is I'm just zip tying a couple connections just to make sure that those wires stay out of the way. A couple of upgrades I would have liked to do but I couldn't get my hands on is an extra USB card. That's always very handy when building a system like this, because you know you're going to be plugging in cameras and other extra devices to try and move your video content onto the machine. So you can see I'm just tying up the graphics card power cable there, just to make sure that everything looks good before I do the final install of the case. So this is what the final build looked like. Hope you enjoyed this video. I did add a CD player. It was pretty simple to install, so I didn't show that in this video, but this was a really simple build, and I believe a beginner could do this. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this content, please press that like button and subscribe if you're new here. See you in the next one.